Preparing for a DevRel Engineer at Vercel interview? You've reached Candy Mentor, and this video is for you. We'll walk through 20 key questions you're likely to face. For each question you'll see a sample answer followed by the key points to cover. Subscribe, like, and share, and drop a topic request in the comments. Question 1. How would you explain Vercel's value proposition to a developer who already deploys applications successfully? I would start with the developer's existing workflow rather than reciting features. Vercel reduces friction between writing front-end code and delivering it globally through Git-based previews, managed deployments, strong defaults, and integrated observability. The value is faster iteration without forcing teams to assemble every infrastructure layer themselves. I would acknowledge alternatives honestly, then demonstrate a relevant workflow using the customer's framework, traffic pattern, and team constraints. Credibility comes from showing outcomes, not simply claiming Vercel is faster. While answering, focus on developer experience, front-end infrastructure, global performance, preview deployments, workflow integration, measurable benefits, and avoiding vague marketing claims or comparisons unsupported by evidence. Question 2. Design a technical workshop that teaches developers to build and deploy a Next.js application on Vercel. I would design the workshop around a small product, such as a searchable documentation site. Participants would create routes, fetch data, add loading and error states, commit to Git, and deploy a preview before discussing production promotion. Each exercise would produce a visible result, with starter branches and solution branches for recovery. I would include a short explanation of rendering choices, environment variables, and observability. The final challenge would extend the app, proving understanding rather than rewarding copy-paste speed. Make sure to cover audience assumptions, learning objectives, progressive exercises, repository setup, deployment checkpoints, failure recovery, accessibility, timeboxing, and post-workshop resources participants can use independently. Question 3. How would you measure whether a Vercel developer relations program is successful? I would define success by funnel stage. Reach includes qualified views and event attendance, activation includes successful deployments or SDK usage, and retention includes repeat usage, community participation, or continued project growth. I would combine product analytics with surveys, interviews, support themes, and content attribution because no single metric explains developer behavior. For each campaign, I would establish a baseline, a target, and a review date. I would optimize for useful adoption and trust, not merely impressions or follower counts. In your answer, distinguish reach from impact, discuss activation and retention funnels, content attribution, qualitative feedback, developer sentiment, community health, and business metrics without treating vanity metrics as outcomes. Question 4. A developer says their Next.js application is slow after deploying to Vercel. How would you troubleshoot it? I would first reproduce the problem across devices, routes, and regions, then separate server response time from client rendering and asset loading. I would inspect core web vitals, deployment logs, traces, bundle size, image usage, cache behavior, and data fetching waterfalls. Next, I would form one hypothesis at a time. Perhaps a dynamic request prevents caching or a large client component delays interaction. I would validate each change with a controlled deployment and compare real user data, not rely solely on local lighthouse scores. Be sure to mention reproducing the issue, core web vitals, server and client timing, caching, bundle analysis, data fetching waterfalls, geographic variation, logs, traces, and communicating hypotheses before prescribing fixes. Question 5. How would you explain server-side rendering, static generation, and client-side rendering to a mixed experience audience? I describe rendering as deciding when the first useful HTML is created. Static generation prepares it ahead of time, making delivery fast and cacheable. Server rendering creates it per request, supporting fresher or personalized data. Client rendering sends more responsibility to the browser. In Next.js, these approaches can coexist by route or component. I would choose based on data freshness, personalization, SEO, and interaction needs. The practical goal is not picking one ideology, but minimizing work before users can understand and use the page. Focus on when HTML is produced, trade-offs involving freshness, latency, interactivity, caching, SEO, and infrastructure cost, using a simple analogy while connecting choices to Next.js implementation patterns. Question 6. How would you handle a technical disagreement with an engineering team about a public-facing recommendation? I would first understand the team's concern and separate the technical claim from the communication goal. Then I would bring concrete evidence, such as benchmarks, documentation, support data, or a reproducible example, while acknowledging uncertainty. If disagreement remained, I would propose a small experiment or consult the responsible experts. Public guidance must be accurate, so I would not publish a claim merely to meet a deadline. Once the decision is made, I would communicate it consistently and document the reasoning for future contributors. In your answer, discuss listening first, clarifying evidence, distinguishing facts from preferences, testing claims, protecting accuracy, documenting decisions, and presenting a unified message after resolution. Question 7. What makes technical documentation effective for developers adopting a platform like Vercel? Effective documentation helps a developer complete a real task quickly, then understand why the solution works. I would provide prerequisites, a minimal runnable example, expected output, common failure modes, and links to deeper concepts. Examples should use current APIs, be tested automatically where possible, and avoid hiding important configuration. I would organize content by user intent rather than internal architecture, label version-specific behavior, and review analytics plus support questions regularly. Documentation is a product surface, so maintenance and feedback are part of the work. Make sure to cover task-oriented structure, accurate prerequisites, runnable examples, conceptual context, progressive complexity, error handling, versioning, accessibility, searchability, and feedback loops from real users. Question 8. How would you turn a new Vercel platform feature into a developer education campaign? I would begin by identifying the problem the feature solves and the developers most likely to feel it. Then I would create a message hierarchy, a short working demo, a conceptual guide, a reference example, and migration or troubleshooting material. I would coordinate launch timing with product, engineering, support, and marketing so every channel tells the same truth. After release, I would monitor adoption, questions, and failed attempts, then update content quickly. A campaign succeeds when developers can independently apply the feature to meaningful projects. Discuss audience segmentation, positioning, use case selection, launch assets, demos, documentation, community amplification, feedback collection, measurement, and coordination with product, engineering, marketing, and support teams. Question 9. How would you build a compelling live demo for a Vercel or Next.js feature? I would choose one believable problem and make the benefit visible within minutes. For example, a content site could show a Git commit creating a preview, a reviewer leaving feedback, and production receiving an approved change. I would keep dependencies minimal, use prepared checkpoints, and rehearse network failures, authentication issues, and timing surprises. The audience should receive a working repository and clear next steps. I would explain trade-offs during the demo, because a polished result without operational context can create misleading expectations. While answering, cover a realistic user problem, visible value, minimal dependencies, rehearsed failure paths, performance considerations, source code availability, audience interaction, and a clear transition from demonstration to adoption. Question 10. How would you respond to a critical developer post about Vercel in a public community? I would acknowledge the frustration publicly without becoming defensive, summarize what I understand, and ask for non-sensitive reproduction details. If the issue involves account data or an incident, I would move those details to a private channel while keeping the public thread updated. I would reproduce the behavior, involve the appropriate engineering or support team, and share verified findings rather than speculate. After resolution, I would explain the fix or workaround and capture the lesson in documentation or a product request. Be sure to mention empathy, fact-finding, public acknowledgement, privacy boundaries, reproducibility, escalation, transparent updates, and converting recurring issues into documentation, product improvements, or support guidance. Question 11. Explain edge functions and when you would recommend them over traditional server execution. Edge functions execute closer to users, which can reduce latency for request handling, personalization, redirects, and lightweight API logic. I would recommend them when geographic responsiveness matters and the workload fits the runtime's supported APIs and resource limits. I would avoid forcing edge execution for heavy computation, native dependencies, long-running jobs, or systems requiring centralized state. Before recommending it, I would test real regional latency and understand caching, consistency, and observability. Location helps, but runtime compatibility and operational simplicity still matter. Focus on geographic proximity, startup behavior, runtime constraints, request latency, supported APIs, state management, observability, cost, and cases where a conventional Node.js environment remains the better choice. Question 12. How would you explain caching and revalidation in a Next.js application deployed on Vercel? I explain caching as reusing a response or rendered result until a defined condition says it is stale. In Next.js, the decision depends on the request, fetch configuration, route behavior, and revalidation strategy. Public product data may tolerate time-based revalidation, while personalized data should avoid shared caching. I would define what freshness means, how invalidation occurs after content changes, and what happens during regeneration. Then I would verify cache hits, misses, and regional behavior with headers, logs, and repeatable requests rather than assumptions. In your answer, clarify cache keys, static versus dynamic data, revalidation timing, invalidation, stale content risks, personalization, headers, and how to verify behavior through logs and controlled requests. Question 13. What is your approach to gathering and prioritizing developer feedback for Vercel products? I would collect feedback from support conversations, community discussions, interviews, issue trackers, events, and product analytics. I would tag each item by user type, workflow, frequency, severity, and evidence quality, then distinguish a symptom from its underlying problem. Prioritization should consider impact, strategic fit, confidence, and engineering cost rather than the loudest request. I would share synthesized themes with product teams and return to contributors with what changed, what did not, and why. Closing that loop builds stronger long-term participation. Cover multiple feedback channels, user segmentation, evidence quality, frequency versus severity, strategic fit, effort, reproducibility, synthesis, roadmap influence, and closing the loop with contributors. Question 14. How would you teach developers to secure environment variables and secrets in a Vercel project? I would explain that any variable exposed to browser code is public, regardless of its name, so secrets must remain server-side and be accessed only where needed. I would store values in the platform's environment settings, separate development, preview, and production scopes, and keep them out of repositories and logs. I would use least privilege credentials, rotate exposed secrets immediately, and audit preview access when sensitive data is involved. A secure example should demonstrate both correct configuration and what accidental exposure looks like. Be sure to cover public versus server-only variables, repository hygiene, environment scopes, secret rotation, build logs, preview security, least privilege, accidental exposure detection, and incident response. Question 15. How would you design an inclusive technical conference talk for a global developer audience? I would research the audience's experience levels, languages, regional constraints, and likely goals before writing the talk. I would use plain language, explain necessary terms, provide captions and readable contrast, and avoid relying on speed, idioms, or tiny code samples. The narrative would move from problem to solution to trade-offs, with a repository and written recap for different learning styles. I would collect questions asynchronously as well as live, and review feedback from participants who are often underrepresented in conference conversations. Discuss audience research, plain language, accessible slides, captions, code readability, diverse examples, time zone and cultural awareness, multiple learning formats, and mechanisms for questions from less vocal attendees. Question 16. How would you compare Vercel with another deployment platform without making unfair claims? I would avoid declaring a universal winner and establish criteria tied to the user's workload, framework support, preview workflows, latency, caching, observability, compliance, team operations, and total cost. I would define the test application, regions, traffic shape, cache state, and measurement period so comparisons are reproducible. I would present Vercel's strengths and limitations alongside the alternatives. Honest trade-offs are more persuasive than selective benchmarks, and they help developers choose a platform that fits their actual constraints. Focus on transparent evaluation criteria, workload fit, pricing assumptions, performance methodology, developer workflow, operational features, limitations, reproducible tests, and recommending based on customer requirements. Question 17. What would you include in a developer onboarding journey for a new Vercel user? I would optimize the first journey around a successful deployment within minutes, then introduce complexity only when it becomes relevant. The path would connect a repository, detect the framework, create a preview, explain environment scopes, promote a change to production, and show where to inspect logs and performance. Each step would have an expected result and recovery guidance. I would instrument drop-off points, interview new users, and improve confusing steps. Onboarding should create confidence first, while deeper platform capabilities can follow progressively. Make sure to cover time to first success, framework detection, Git integration, preview deployment, environment setup, production promotion, observability, troubleshooting, progressive education, and activation milestones. Question 18. How would you work with an open-source community around a Vercel-related project? I would make contribution paths explicit through a clear README, development setup, code of conduct, issue templates, and guidance for documentation, code, and examples. I would label issues carefully, respond predictably, and explain roadmap decisions without promising every request. Security reports would use a private process, while ordinary discussions remain open. I would recognize contributors and share release notes that explain impact. Healthy open source depends on maintainers setting boundaries as well as welcoming participation, so sustainability matters as much as enthusiasm. In your answer, discuss governance, contribution guidelines, issue triage, maintainer responsiveness, inclusive conduct, roadmap transparency, release discipline, security reporting, and recognizing community contributions. Question 19. How would you explain observability to a front-end-focused developer deploying on Vercel? I would frame observability as understanding what users and systems experienced, not merely collecting logs. Browser performance signals show interaction quality, while server logs, request metrics, and traces reveal where time or failures occur across boundaries. I would add structured context such as root, deployment, and request identifiers, while excluding sensitive data. During an incident, I would start with symptoms, narrow using correlated evidence, and verify the fix with both technical and real user metrics. Good observability shortens diagnosis and prevents repeat failures. Cover logs, metrics, traces, user experience signals, correlation across browser and server, structured events, alerting, privacy, debugging workflows, and using observability to validate improvements. Question 20. Tell me about a developer relations project you led, including a failure or lesson learned. I once launched a tutorial campaign that attracted strong traffic but produced weak activation. I had optimized the headline and distribution while underestimating setup friction and assumed readers understood the prerequisite concepts. I reviewed analytics, watched users attempt the tutorial, and interviewed several participants. We added a smaller starter project, clearer environment guidance, checkpoints, and a troubleshooting section. Completion and successful deployments improved afterward. The lesson was to measure the behavior I wanted, not confuse attention with developer value. Be sure to mention the original developer problem, your ownership, collaborators, decisions, measurable outcome, failure evidence, course correction, and what the experience changed about your future technical communication. If you are still with us, congratulations, you are much ahead of the rest and serious about preparing for your interview. We hope we were able to add value to your preparation and create some helpful content. Do not forget to like and share this video. Your small act can do great things for us.